Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Cindy Rogers and I'm filling in for Molly Sarver, who is the Senior Land Use Planner with Indiana County Office of Planning and Development. We are the Indiana County Sustainable Economic Development Task Force. And I just want to tell you a little bit about the task force before we start into our presentation. In April of 2017, the Indiana County Commissioners held the first Sustainable Economic Summit, and that sort of started us off. It was a joint effort of Evergreen Conservancy, the League of Women Voters, and the Center for Community Growth, and our county commissioners who supported us. That at the time, that was Mike Baker, Rod Ruddick, and Shireen Hess, who, after we submitted a report, accepted it and established the task force. It was publicly launched in September of 2017, and the task force was made up of a hugely diversified group of people from the county who came together and met every month and developed goals and a wish list of what we would like to see happen in the county. There were 4 focus groups: agriculture, renewable energy, building materials and construction, and environmental restoration and stewardship. And each one of those focus groups hit on these 3 pillars: workforce development, economic development, and citizen education. So what we did was we looked at what we wanted to do in each one of those focus groups related to these 3 things and came up with a report. And that report was finished and completed and presented to the commissioners. Once it was done, we had to come up with a new mission that we prioritized our goals, and then we thought, well, we need to implement these goals somehow now. So we did come up with a new mission to set priorities and determine the feasibilities and actually implement some of our goals. These are general overall goals and recommendations from the task force. We also would love to see an Office of Sustainability. We don't have that yet, but Molly is the sustainability coordinator, so we're working towards that. We also have an annual summit, and we've been doing that every year except last year, and this is our first ever virtual summit. So we are continuing to meet that goal to offer a lot of amazing presentations to the public. And they will all be recorded, and you can see them in case you missed what we have today. We also want to incorporate all our goals into a long-range plan so they don't sit on the shelf somewhere. And we also want to support broadband across the county, because that's so important to offer people the options of being able to work from home through broadband and other aspects of it. In 2018, we did offer the completed report, and it was adopted by Indiana County Commissioners. All our previous summits are on our website, and you can see them at sustainableindianacounty.org. And we have all those previous summit events recorded. If you want to get more involved in the Sustainability Task Force or have any questions, you can reach us at these numbers that are on the screen right now, or at our sustainableindianacounty@gmail.com or sustainableindianacounty.org website. We are proud to present this year's summit. It was quite a challenge to do it virtually, but we're moving forward with it. We've had great presentations so far. And this year's will be on our website eventually, as soon as we can get them up there. But if you can see this year's presentations recorded on Facebook right now, if you want to. So to learn more, visit our website and find out all the exciting things that we're doing. Oh, and I should also mention at the end, you'll be directed to a survey, and we would really appreciate it if you would fill it out. And while the presentation's going on, you can ask questions in the chat room, and I will keep an eye on that and ask the presenters any questions that you might have. Now, I'm excited to present to you our topic for today, which is conservation and climate solutions on rented farmland. And I'm going to turn the presentation over to Bonnie McGill from Carnegie Museum of Natural History, and she will introduce the folks that she has with her. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and turn it over to Bonnie.
Great, thanks, Cindy. Let me share my screen. All up there. Okay. So yeah, this is a session we've designed for non-operator landowners and just non-farmer community members to learn more about how farming and rented farmland in particular are part of the climate solution. And so I'd like to start, I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so you can just see all of our faces. So yeah, as Cindy said, I work at the museum. I graduated from Marion Center Area High School. I grew up in Home, and I have a PhD in agricultural ecology from Michigan State University. And so I'd like to turn it over to introduce our farmer from Indiana that's joining us, Mr. Ted Kazemcek. If you want to tell us about you and your operation, what you grow, how much land it's on, how long you've been doing it.
Well, I've been doing it all my life, so that's 60 years. We cover about 1,800 acres now. Probably 1,400 of that is rented land across about 28 different properties. Some large, some as small as a few acres, some 150 acres. We've just always, I would say most of my ground, 80% of it is rented on a handshake deal. Just basically a man's word. And that has always seemed to work the best for us. I do have some written leases. Probably, half of them are leases that I wanted written to cover myself. The others are leases that were written that people, they just wanted a lease. They were more comfortable with a lease, which isn't a problem. I don't know that written leases are an absolute thing necessary even in today's world, but they will cover both parties if there's ever a dispute, I suppose. But we've never run into that. I don't have a lot of issues with my landowners as far as conservation ideas, this or that, and I kind of give that, I would say, as an indication that we do a pretty good job of what we do. Because if you do a terrible job, you'll certainly know, you'll be told. Even by someone who doesn't have any idea what you're doing, they can see that this guy's doing an awful job. But so far so good. Over probably the last 45 years that we've been leasing land, we've had very, very few complaints. So I guess we must be doing something right. There's always some new things you can try. We try new things every year, but we are trying to progress. No.
And I think you grow corn, soy, and wheat.
Yes, corn, soy, wheat, and oats. We used to be large in the hay business as a commercial hay grower, but we've phased that out in the last several years. Just for several reasons. Time-wise was a problem. Weather had been a problem for 2 or 3 years there. When it rained every other day, that was quality issues were killing us there. And something had to give, so that's what went. But we still rotate with the corn, with the oats and the wheat. So we're trying to do, and we've gone into some cover crops also. And now my son is back from school. He's 22 years old and ready to work every day. So I can take an hour off in the middle of the day to do this.
Awesome. Well, thanks to you and your son for being with us today. And I also would like to introduce Mr. Justin Brackenridge, who's joining us from Penn State Extension. Justin, why don't you tell us about yourself and what you do?
Sure. Thank you. So I'm an agronomy educator on the field and forage crop team with Penn State Extension. And my degrees came from WVU. I have one in animal nutrition and one in agronomy. So I've been with Penn State for about 3.5 years now, and I work out of Butler County, but I serve the farmers and producers in Indiana as well. So my job is to mostly work with producers if they want to talk about fertility or weed management, anything that really they have that they'd like to do on their farms that they can improve with. They kind of call me and troubleshoot that. And I do a lot of farm visits, going out to work with them on anything that they may need help with. But I also do kind of work with landowners and how they can monitor their situations or anything else that they may want to know that we can provide from an agricultural standpoint.
Awesome. So glad you both are here. And folks who are joining us, they might have also expected to see Jeff Fenton here from Fenton Meats in Marion Center. He had something come up and so he can't join us, but I think the three of us will make for an interesting panel regardless. I'm going to share my screen again. I have a couple slides that I'm going to go through and then we'll hear from Justin and Ted and have kind of a discussion. So I'd like to start actually by using the chat. If people want to put in there, my relationship to farming is, and that might be, I drive by farms, or it might be, I'm a landowner and I rent to farmers. It might be, I'm a farmer. Whatever your position is, you click on that chat button down at the bottom of your screen. So hopefully we can get a couple people to tell us where they're coming from so we know who all is, who's in the room. That's a good one, Cindy. You eat produce. We all rely on farmers. You grow a big garden. Awesome. I don't know if any of the other participants want to chime in. And I can call on Vera, especially because I know her and I see her name there. So maybe Vera can tell us something there. But I'll go ahead and move on, but if people want to put things in there. Ooh, living in California, lived around a lot of strawberry fields. Raven Sanchez is our kind of technology person here helping us, and we thank you also, Raven. Great. So next slide. So here's our kind of ag agenda. Get it? Ag agenda. So first we're gonna talk about, why care about rented farmland. So that might be kind of a new concept to you, like, wait a minute, farmers rent land. Also talk about conservation practices on farms that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon. And we'll hear from Ted about farmer perspectives on rented land, leases, conservation practices, and have an audience Q&A at the end, or even sprinkled throughout as questions come up. We can definitely pause. And if there's any like farm jargon words we use that you're not familiar with, we'll try to catch those, but feel free to be like, what do you mean by that? So feel free to do that. So here's a map showing the percent of county land in farms that is rented or leased. And the most recent data was from 2017. And it goes from this like yellowish being less than 15% to this dark blue, which is 60 or more percent. You can see there's like really heavy areas of rented ag where there's this maybe more, valuable, productive, intensely agricultural regions. But PA, we're definitely not far off either. So let's zoom in on PA. Whoops. So the average for Pennsylvania is about 30%. And in Indiana County, it's 33% of our land, of our farm land, not all of our land. And there's some evidence that less conservation might happen on rented land. Not always the case, but that's kind of a place where we can look and say, hey, if we have a watershed water quality goal, and we're only talking with farmers who own their farmland or can implement this on their farmed land, what's the role of landowners to helping make conservation more accessible for the farmers that rent their land? So that's kind of the why we're interested in rented farmland. Recently, researchers from the American Farmland Trust, Gabrielle Roche McNally and Amy Jacobs from the Nature Conservancy, as well as an organization called Trust in Food, they did a survey by mail of Pennsylvania and Maryland farmers and non-operator landowners, or you see NOLs there, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And so the Chesapeake Bay has a lot of pressure on them to clean up kind of what's going on because of pollution in the Chesapeake Bay. So there's a lot of attention on farmers there. So that's kind of why they focused the survey there. But there are some possible similarities between what farmers in that region are saying and what is happening here in Western PA. So one of the big reasons for landowners to own land that they keep as farmland is the legacy. So thinking either about future generations in their family or future generations in general to conserve farmland. So like the American Farmland Trust bumper stickers say, no farm, no foods. And you can think like if this is their main interest for future generations, then potentially appealing to people about mediating climate change and improving the resilience of the soils might also be of interest. But a lot of landowners don't really see that they have a role in making that happen. In the survey, they also found that leases are often long-term relationships, like 10 years, but they're an annual term, and they're often verbal, like Ted said. Regarding written leases, both non-operating landowners and farmers are interested and willing to do written leases, sort of also like Ted spoke to. But a lot of farmers perceive that landowners don't want a written lease and don't want to rock the boat in that relationship. But landowners are more willing than that perception. And you can kind of have that perception on the other side too. The landowner doesn't want to rock the boat with their tenant farmer either. So that's this kind of like sweet spot where we can maybe build relationships and incentivize conservation on farms to a greater extent than we can now. And that involves both sides, especially the landowners, what they can do. An advantage of a written lease is that it could be for a longer period of time. So one or more of the barriers that farmers mentioned or barriers towards doing more conservation practices on rented acres is that they don't have an assurance that they'll have access to that land long term to make the investment worth it. Because a lot of conservation practices, it kind of takes several years for it to start working and really benefiting the farmer themselves. And other barriers are also entry costs, return on investment, maintenance costs. And so the assurance of length of time in their lease is a place where the landowner can offer some more support. And in the survey, 75% of the farmers have not worked with the non-operating landowners to implement conservation practices. So room to grow. So if there's room to grow, in terms of conservation practices on farms, what are those conservation practices that are suitable to Indiana County soils, climate, and methods of production? And how do we improve those landlord-tenant-farmer relationships to work toward conservation and climate change mitigation? Some of the goals for conservation could be to improve soil resilience to extreme weather. This could be seen as like an insurance policy for farmers. One of the big problems right now is either the soils being way too wet or way too dry. Improving environmental quality, water quality, wildlife habitat, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we'll talk a little more about that. And another goal can be to sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the soil. So ag actually has a big role to play in being part of climate solutions and being climate heroes. And so increasing the soil organic matter, which you're going to hear about, will help with both those too wet and too dry soils. And before I hand it over to Justin to talk more about conservation practices, I'm going to just talk for another couple minutes to explain greenhouse gas emissions from farming and the potential for carbon sequestration. So if we look at all man-made greenhouse gas emissions for the US for 2018, major part of that is CO2. But there are also other gases like methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases that are contributing to it. But CO2 is like the big one, and this is across all sectors. If we parse that out by sector, transportation and energy production are over half. Those are the big ones. Industry, that includes things like cement production and other processes for manufacturing and such that emit greenhouse gases. And then ag is about 10%, so it's not a huge part. But if you think about the goals for the Paris Climate Agreement, it was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the US by like 5% by 2025. So you can see that that's that 10% is in play for helping to meet those climate goals. And then lastly for me is talking about soil organic matter. That's really important for a lot of benefits to the farmer, and hopefully Ted can talk a little about that in his experiences, but to also say that that's carbon storage right there. So the soil is very much alive like you and me, and it contains millions of living things like worms, roots, invertebrates, larvae, microbes, and fungi. And plant roots work with microbes and fungi to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in the soil. And when soil is plowed or tilled, the oxygen flushes the soil, and different microbes chew up a lot of that carbon in the soil, and they breathe out CO2, just like you and I. So that's one of the benefits of no-till, is you're not disturbing the CO2 that is stored in the soil. Crop residues, including from cover crops that are left in the field, help feed carbon to the soil as well. So the carbon in those plants was CO2 from the atmosphere. But to know that soil carbon storage is not an infinite place where we can just like keep building for hundreds of years, but they do have a lot of room to grow where we have historically farmed. And this is an important part of mitigating climate change and could be kind of a long-term insurance policy for farming. So I have come at this with kind of my ecologist perspective for conservation and climate mitigation angle, but these practices also can help make economic sense for farmers. And so I'm going to turn it over to Justin, who can talk about that side of it and what some more specifics on what conservation practices are happening or can happen on the land to support organic matter and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So Justin, you can take it away, and I will stop sharing my screen. We can all just like talk.
Sure. So as Bonnie approached me about nitrogen and gas emissions, we kind of look at this as the nitrogen cycle and how we can be more. So that was the first place we wanted to talk on this, right? Is nitrogen emissions and nitrogen applications in our crops, right? So we have a couple of different ways that we would do this. And from a landowner perspective, or even from a farmer perspective, we're thinking about nitrogen as being one of our macronutrients, one of those plant essential elements. And we kind of pick on two of them, right? We kind of pick on phosphorus and we pick on nitrogen as being our two kind of guilty parties as causing most of our problems when it comes to the environmental impact. We don't really want the other ones to get carried away either. But if we think of things with the Chesapeake Bay, typically our minds sort of drift towards phosphorus and those issues, but from this greenhouse gas portion of it, we tend to drift back towards nitrogen. And so we use a concept when we start thinking about really any type of a nutrient placement, and we call it the 4 R's. And those R's stand for, so I'm going to cheat. I have some, whoop.
I skipped my N2O slides. Do you want me to set that up?
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
'Cause that might help make a little more sense. I'm sorry about that. My bad.
I can do nitrogen cycling, but you're probably better at it than me.
Let me do this part. Hang on a second. Let me go. Sorry, folks. There we go. And let me share that. Too many windows to navigate here. There we go. Okay. So one of the, let's see. One of those gases that I showed earlier was the nitrous oxide portion of this pie here. And where does that come from? A lot of that comes from agriculture. So here we're looking at all the emissions in the US of nitrous oxide, and a lot of that's coming from agriculture. So where is that coming from? And that's a greenhouse gas, if I didn't make that clear. So after nitrogen fertilizer is applied to fields, some of it is taken up by the plant, some of it leaches away into the soil with rainwater, and some of it is taken up by soil microbes who, when they run out of oxygen, if it's like waterlogged soil or they're in like a tiny pore of the soil, they'll run out of oxygen, and they can turn to using nitrate as an energy or a source for their respiration. So they breathe in nitrate, which is kind of different from what we do, and then they breathe out N2, dinitrogen gas, which is inert, and it's like 78% of the air that we breathe. But they also emit N2O. They breathe out nitrous oxide, which is the same as laughing gas. And one molecule of N2O has about 300 times the warming power in the atmosphere as CO2. So there's a lot more details we can get into, but that's all we really need to cover for now, and to help you understand why I asked Justin to talk about how we can tighten up the nitrogen cycle on farms. So, okay, Justin, go ahead. Sorry about that.
No problem. So when we think about applying nitrogen, what we want to do is we want to think about these 4 R's. And so these R's are going to be right source, right rate, right time, and right place. And these could be said for all of our nutrients. But as we think about these a little bit more on their own, in right source, right? So that's going to be really kind of the place we start, and can be one of these really complicated discussions that we have about nitrogen. And I get into this with a lot of the producers. And so from a landowner standpoint, this is something that you would maybe talk to your farmer about as to what type of application they're making, what their infrastructure is like to make this application. One of the things that we're really looking at now in the agricultural world is through environmental cleanups, we've kind of lessened the amount of sulfur that's in our environment and in our atmosphere. And so a lot of our agronomic crops are needing sulfur additions. And so we're kind of drifting towards, we're using a lot of ammonium sulfate. And as we start to use ammonium sulfate, maybe that isn't the right source, right? Maybe we should be using something more like urea or a liquid solution. And so that's really what that's meaning of, we have to kind of tailor this type of a product for the type of the crop or the type of environment that we're looking at. If we're in a very wet environment, that's also going to help in this denitrification process. And so we don't want to put more of these unstable products in there when we're using something ammonium sulfate. So sulfur is something, if we were in the Midwest where we had very basic soils, we would acidify with sulfur. And so here, we can also make our soils more acidic by using ammonium sulfate over time. And so that's something we also kind of need to be cognizant of, is we're acidifying with the nitrogen, we're also acidifying with the sulfur. So that's where we want to talk about this right source, is are we making the right decisions? Are we working with an agronomist? And is this right for our plant? So this kind of goes really big picture here. It's not just only from a greenhouse gas standpoint, but are we doing the best thing for our crop and our environment and in total fate? Right rate. As an agronomist, we sign a contract, to joke, but we have to talk to everybody about soil testing every time we get them in a room. We always encourage soil testing because we want to make all of our recommendations based on a soil test. And that's looking at the soils, that's looking at the parts per million or the pounds per acre of the nutrients in those soils. And so now we're adjusting the nutrient levels in those soils based on a crop removal. And so nitrogen's a little different, right? If you're familiar with how nitrogen moves in that cycle, it can volatilize, meaning it turns into a gas. It can leach, which means it's going to move with water. It can be consumed by bacteria. And so we base all of our nitrogen rates it's on a crop removal. And so we did a bunch of tests over a bunch of years, and we took crops and we put nitrogen on them. And we kind of found this threshold that said, at this rate, we're no longer going to see a positive response by putting more nitrogen on it. And so if we say, all right, this corn crop, we need 170 bushel of corn is what our target is, we just go to a table and say, well, what we really need is, about, I'm going to cheat again, about 0.67 is what this table is saying. Typically, we would go about 1 unit per bushel, but this one's slightly under that. And it's all based on those removal rates. And so that's how we get into this right rate. We're wanting to tailor that instead of this blanket statement of we're going to go out and put 150 pounds of nitrogen down. We want to go specifically to the crop. The next one we would look at is the right time. So this is going to be for anything, whether it's agronomics, whether your garden, whether your yard. Nitrogen is used when the plant is growing. And so we can start with a little bit of nitrogen, but nitrogen is used to make that plant green. So the greener the plant, the higher the demand and the more of the use that we're seeing in that chlorophyll. And so typically when we talk about nitrogen demands, we would put those on when that corn crop is going to be smaller. We want that plant to be actively growing. We want higher phosphorus and potassium levels in the beginning to develop that plant as it starts. We want those roots to establish. And then once that plant is actively growing, that's when we want the nitrogen to be there, because that's when we're going to get that jolt. And so we talk about right timing. And this is something that Ted's probably going to talk about, but we recommend split applying so that you put a little bit down in the front to just get it going. We kind of nudge it when those soils are cool and they're a little damp. And then later, once things warm up, they're around June, and that plant really has that high demand and it really wants to start stretching out. That's when we come back and we hit it hard because that keeps it from having those losses and those different fates that we don't want, right? That's when we don't want those leaching or that volatilizing. And then our last thing is placement. Are we going to the right place? This is a big thing that we look at now in agriculture because of the technologies we've developed. This is something, probably in the last 5 to 10 years that we've really gotten involved with is grid sampling, right? We can go out and we can look at these really specific placements. We can take fertilizer and we can place them right exactly to the edge of the root. We can dribble this stuff as a liquid right down beside the plant versus going out and broadcasting it and getting nitrogen in between the rows where it then has to wash downward for something to intercept. And so holistically, what we do is we look at these 4 R's, we put this all together as a package, and we say, this is the best way that we can reduce environmental losses, but we can also help our crops agronomically. And so holistically, that kind of gives us nitrogen management in a nutshell. I mean, that's 5 minutes of nitrogen management. She talked a little bit about getting carbon into soils. No-tilling is a great way to look at something like that. And so what that means is instead of tilling or disking every year, what we're going to do is we're going to cut a smaller slit and we're going to place that seed into it rather than opening up that whole area. When we open that up, that lets that carbon gas come out. But what we're doing is we're really reducing our disturbance. And that's a great way to do that. We look at cover cropping as a way to kind of capture that. Cover cropping is another great way to scavenge some of this nitrogen, right? So if we have any nitrogen that was left at the end of the year, we can really get specific with some of these cover crops, and we can target some of these things. So if we think of something like a turnip or a radish, they're designed because they've got a very deep tuber, a very deep root. They're going to go down and break up some compaction. We look at something like rye or our grasses, they're going to be designed to, their planting design, right? Not the plants design, but the planting design that we use them for is to go out and grab any of this leftover nitrogen. They pull it back up into their vegetative mass, and then they die at the end of the year. And then that leaches back down into our soils when we need them later. And so all of this together really works with us because we're getting the carbon from that biomass as it decomposes on top as leaf litter. We're getting the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium that they've left over, and we're holding that in place. We're armoring our soils to stop any of this erosion that we may have lost phosphorus and potassium through that way. These practices work really great in unison, but it's small steps, right, to get us there, because we have to transition to these over time together. So Bonnie, do you have anything else you'd like me to touch on with those?
I think that was awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. And so at this point, I would like to turn it over and pepper Ted with some questions.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to talk about the conservation practices as well as your relationship with landowners and leases. So while we're just following up with what Justin was talking about, can you tell us a little bit about why you choose, for a long time, you've been doing no-till and cover crops. Why did you choose to do that? And what are some of the benefits that you've seen from it?
Well, I would say, cover crop is something we're fairly new at. I mean, the last 3 or 4 years, we've increased more and more there. Probably most of our cover crop now goes into wheat stubble, because once we harvest wheat, you have to put something there. You'll get a tremendous crop of weeds growing. And then we have already planted corn into that green mass in the spring before we killed it, kind of roll it down and plant. That sometimes is a good thing. Sometimes that doesn't work. It was funny you mentioned radishes. We planted radishes. I have 180 acres of them planted this year, tillage radishes and crimson clover, and they do wonderful. But there again, I mean, there's one thing that there's an aspect of that you don't realize what's going to happen. Here in the last week, when it warmed up, those radishes rot in the field, and they can create quite the smell for about a week. So there again, you're creating complaints that people don't quite understand. Why does that stink so bad? Well, it's those radishes rotting. They disappear in a week. It's like anything else, but it's a new thing for them. They wonder what's going on there. The no-till aspect, probably we were forced into that, I would say, simply through economics. It is so much more economical to no-till, labor-wise, fuel-wise, and as long as it's done correctly, yields probably will increase over time, because once you build some more organic matter, yields are there. The soil itself is healthier. It's a little more, it's firmer in harvest time, simply because it's kind of hard to describe. It's not really hard, but it bears the weight of the machine better on ground that was no-tilled. Going back to the nitrogen thing, I kind of chuckled there when you talk about using ammonium sulfate. We've used ammonium sulfate. 20 years ago, we got lots of free sulfur with acid rain, but since we've cleaned, I would say 20, 30 years, we've cleaned up power plants to the point where we don't get the free sulfur, so now we have to add that. But ammonium sulfate is acidic. You have to watch how much of that, but there are people going to using gypsum. instead of ammonium sulfate to get basically that sulfur that you would have gotten from the power plant free. Now you have to mix it with lime and then spread it. I mean, you know, gypsum's nothing but calcium sulfate. So I guess you just need to be ready to evolve with the process as things go along.
Yeah, and have you seen any benefit for those no-tilled soils in terms of when you have a really dry year or really wet year? Are the no-till soils easier to work with?
And in a really dry year, you will notice the yields will hang on a little better because you haven't lost as much moisture. In a really wet spring, you will be discouraged because that ground won't dry out as fast. You know, you're going to just be itching to go out there and stir that up a little bit to let it dry. That's the one situation, you know, not last year so much, but the year before, the 2 prior years, when it was so wet, there was a lot of ground that was just never going to get to the point where it was dry enough to plant. It just wasn't going to happen. But that's not the general rule, but it can happen where it is so wet that with that much cover on it, it's just not going to dry.
Yeah. And this might be a question for you and Justin. Could cover crops growing at that time help pull water out of the soil?
Oh, they will. A growing cover crop will pull that moisture out of the soil. It will. And ideally, you know, a cover crop that was burn off in the spring and then is laying there basically as a mat of mulch basically is probably the worst thing you want in wet ground.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where a growing cover crop, yes, will pull that moisture up. There again, if it happens to turn dry really quick, that growing cover crop will dry that ground out so hard you can't plant in it. So it's a management decision you have to make every day, I'd say.
Yeah. And Justin, did you have anything to add?
No, he's exactly right. I mean, every spring we have farmers that are in the same position as him, you know, and even where he's talking about planting green right into something that's living, you make a decision there is, do I want to use this to suppress weeds, or do I want to run the risk of having this cover crop take away the water from my corn crop, right? So, and you're constantly trying to flirt that line of, is it going to be a dry spring or a wet spring? Because leaving it alive will help you get in there and plant. But if you push it too long, then you can kind of take away some of the water from your cash crop. So no, he nailed it.
So we've kind of gotten into some of the kind of technical decision making that farmers make that might not be directly within the purview of landowners. But if you're a landowner or a community member out there, this maybe will give you a taste for what kind of decision making is going on farms and options that farmers have. But turning more toward our landowner audience and their questions about leases and how different things can work. Ted, can you tell us a little more about kind of the different kinds of relationships you have and how a written lease can be helpful or not be helpful?
Well, I would say that the vast majority of the land I have rented is rented from people who farmed all their life, or their parents farmed, you know. And as things have evolved in the last 30 years, you know, the 100-acre farm does not exist anymore. Mm-hmm. People, you know, it's just not economically feasible to do that. So most of the people that I deal with have a good sense of what farming should be, what it should look like. Mm-hmm. As far as leasing and so on, a written lease, you know, obviously you can't write a lease that'll cover every aspect, or else you'd have a 100-page document that none of us could understand. So I would say keep it
Right.
But there again, that's hard to do on rented ground unless you really know your landowner and you're willing to get a long-term lease. And there again, you're committing to a long-term lease yourself. You have to understand that, not only you're tying them up for 10 years, you're tying yourself up for 10 years.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of trade-off. I would say anyone looking to rent land, if they want a written lease, have to be realistic about what they want. There are not a lot of farmers tend to be a little independent in their thoughts. You're probably not going to tell them what they're going to do, this, that, the other, because I guess that's why we're farmers. We don't need someone directing us.
Right. And have, in your experience, or maybe of, your community network, have those 3, 5, or 10-year leases? Does that happen?
I have some 5-year leases. Yes.
Yeah.
I have some. I've never written a 10-year lease. I do lease some ground 5 years at a time. Some people, they don't want to revisit that every year. They don't want the hassle of that. So we'll just come to terms on a 5-year deal. But like I say, the vast majority of the ground I rent is just, year to year to year. I have a stable relationship with them. I know all of these people. But that doesn't always happen.
Mm-hmm.
You have some places, things are a little tighter. Competition's a little greater, where you would maybe want more of a written contract than just a word of mouth, especially with the newer generation, with the turnover of generations. Maybe you knew grandpa, you knew the father, but when the children take over, you don't really know them, they don't know you, and they may just be looking for maximum return. So that can be an issue too.
Thanks. And Justin, I know we were speaking earlier before this, and you mentioned how a landowner can't really ask any farmer to do all of these things. Like, there are some limitations to what they can do. Can you talk more about that?
So one comment I'll make to that before I jump into that is I've seen some things, and so if you're soil testing, right, our soil test recommendations, or any lab would make soil tests for 3 years, right? So when we make a liming recommendation, that's a 3-year type recommendation. And so one of the places when I speak to landowners, they're leasing something, and we can get into like a lease agreement. A 3-year is a good type of a lease, because if you're asking that person to put down lime, they know that they're going to get the life of that investment of lime or fertilizer or something out of what they're putting in. And so, that's a good number. And Ted brought that 3 to 5 years up, or something like that. That lets them know that if they are going to come in there and put a couple $1,000s into amending that soil to be a good profit, because that conversation comes up a lot of, well, they do it on their farm, but they don't do it here. And sometimes, like he mentioned, if they get burned and they've put a bunch of money into a farm, and then someone comes up and says, I'll give you $5 more an acre. Now they've lost their investment in that farm for those fertilizers or that lime. But at that 3-year mark, that's essentially what we're saying. Now you need to re-lime again. And so that gives you a good point to revisit that and say, you've gotten what you put out of that back into it, because we're fertilizing yearly, but the lime is now there. So yeah, so one of the things, we often look about when we talk about things of that. So we were looking into no-till or different types of applications, or incorporating like a small grain or something into rotations of a renter. All of these things are not always possible, right? It's based on the infrastructure of the producer. And typically, if someone is doing something with corn or soybeans, they're often going to be set up to do something with small grains, and they can probably do something that way. But then the difference maybe becomes whether they're a conventional type farmer, that they're geared to do tillage and they're doing those type of practices with a disc and their planters are set up as that versus someone that is set up to do no-till. And back and forth, those switches can be rather expensive for that producer. And so if that's something that you're very adamant about your farm and you say, but I only want to do no-till on this farm, that's something that you may have to discuss with that landowner before you get into that arrangement, because they may not have their planter set up that way because it becomes different wheels in the front, the openers and the closures and the hardware. All of that's very different on that piece of equipment. And so that's a nuance that may be a little different. The nitrogen management, right? If we're talking about fertilizer applications, those can be different depending on the farmer. Some people like to see cover crops or even a forage, right? So some people like to see their ground rested and gone into a forage. Ted mentioned he had hay had kind of gone by the wayside on their farm because of the wet years. Some people like to see their ground sit for a couple years and kind of mellow back out by going into a forage seeding. If you're a grain producer, a lot of times the upkeep of a baler or something like that isn't something you want to invest in. And so those areas are things that before you get into a lease or before you sign something, always have those discussions with your producer and make sure that they can honor that, because they just may not have the equipment at their disposal.
Yeah, anything to add on that, Ted?
Well, I mean, I would certainly agree with that. You know, even in my own aspect, I mean, we were limited, you know, as far as hay production on some of the closer ground. I mean, you're not going to produce hay on ground that's 20 miles from your home operation. It's just not going to work. You know, there are limitations, and then you know, there are just you know, economic things that you just can't do. You know, you can even in our area, you can do a wonderful job no-tilling corn and soybeans, you know, year after year, just by replacing the nutrients, maintaining the soil, and, you know, watching. Well, in a no-till situation, you're not going to have much erosion, if any. So you can do a good stewardship that way, but it has to be done properly. You know, there are limitations to it.
So another one I would throw in there is discussion about weed management, right? As we think about pesticide usage, as a landowner, that's another one. Whatever your feelings are on pesticide usage on your property, that's a discussion to have with your producer before you get into a lease situation as well. Because that's something in no-till situations, it's becoming, it's very common to use those, whether it be an herbicide or we look at fungicides in a lot of our type of operations now. So again, that's another one to bring up before it's too late.
Yeah. Just looking at the time, I have more questions, but I wanted to see if Cindy, if there are any questions that came in that we should attend to.
No, there's no questions in the chat so far, so go
I get
for
to
it.
keep asking questions.
Yep, go ahead.
I was curious, Ted, as you've been experimenting with cover crops, and you mentioned how landowners, like the appearance of their land is really important. Have you had to like explain, like, hey, this is this new thing I'm going to do. It's going to look maybe a little messy. Have you had to have those kinds of conversations with landowners?
No, I have. You know, I guess where we started with the cover crops in wheat ground, you know, I told them what we were doing, you know, and they were fine with it. And you know, and it's certainly a lot nicer look than a giant weed patch out there.
Mm-hmm.
Because we go with the tillage radishes, crimson clover. We did plant about a bushel of oats with that last year. So it looked really nice in the fall, and even now the oats of course is frozen. It's brown, but there's just a solid mat of crimson clover there. So it actually looks very nice. Mm-hmm. You know, but yes, before I would do anything radical that would look really strange, I mean, I would tell them, you know, so that they're aware of what's going on. A lot of people, you know, they're fine with most anything as long as they know ahead of time what why does this look different? And you're kind of have you gone off the beam here? They're thinking, but so if you can just let them know ahead of time, it works fine.
Yeah. Justin, in your experience working with farmers, what have you learned about that?
So I think when planting green started, that was probably the one that was the strangest. And I think that most farmers noticed it. So that was when we started planting into a living cover crop, and whether it was rolled down, so you would plant and then you would roll it with something, and then you would come back and spray it. I think more of the farmers noticed that there was something strange happening there than the general public or the landowner or something. And I think that was the one that got the most phone calls or the most slowdowns beside the road, is why this is standing rye or crimson clover or hairy vetch was all disturbed and there were corn plants coming up out of it. But I think farmers are surprisingly good at staying up on research. And it's pretty common that I get calls from the producers I work with of, have you heard of this? And sometimes they hear about it before I do.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of them that are very well keyed in. And so they hear things and see things that other people may not. And so it never surprises me when they say, I've been thinking about doing this, what do you know about it? And then I have to Google some research that's happening in a different part of the country and then follow up with that. So they're always ready to try something new. And most of them say, if you're not trying something new, this gets boring, or it turns into more of a job than it is fun. So it's always fun to try new things.
Yeah, absolutely. Ted, do you want to add to that? You seem like someone who likes to try new things. And also if you have any kind of closing thoughts or comments in general about leases and landowners and that stuff.
Well, no, I mean, we're willing to try most anything, on a small scale. Probably the thing that limits our ability to try things is the time frame. Because we are squeezed so much, time wise in the spring. You have basically 5 weeks to plant, and you can't be wasting a whole lot of time in that time frame unless things are going well, things are rolling along. But if you're struggling and it's the 25th of May and you don't have a lot in the ground, you don't have a lot of time to try this, that, or the other. But there are years when you have time, and that's when you should utilize, you can say, well, we always wanted to try this. Maybe we should do that now. But I think there are concepts out there that will work here, some things that we can adapt, to work in our part of the world, because we are way far different than you have in the flatlands of the Midwest. If you've ever been out there, I'm sure you have. It's a totally different world than what we deal with here. But I don't know. I guess to wrap things up, I would say that we do have to conserve what we have. We have to there's a fine line between conserving what we have and maintaining our operation, because as fun as it is, it still has to be profitable. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise you won't last very long at a loss.
Right. Thank you. And Justin, what closing thoughts do you have for us?
I think that resonates, right? It's fun, but you've got to be profitable. Right? I think that's a very sound closing statement. And I'm here to help, right? Is I try to be the advocate for both sides of this. If you're a farmer or if you're a landowner, I try to be as neutral third party as I can possibly be in all of this. But, it's important for us. We don't always know both sides of everybody's thoughts, right? And it helps. Farmers are really busy people. And, we say, we'll understand what they're doing, but boy, it's tough to get, as Ted just mentioned, they're busy. So how do you get Ted to come over and tell you what he's got going on, right? And so that's where I come in and I can say, this is why he's busy, right? And this is what's going on here. And I think a lot of that helps to get that education and understand why things are the way they are. And so if there's anything I can do to help, but it is a two-way street. Renting, being the landowner, being the person that's renting that, is very much a two-way street. And if you've got a good renter, be thankful. So.
Great. I don't think I can top those conclusions. I just want to thank both Justin and Ted for joining us today. Justin Brackenridge with Penn State Extension and Ted Kazemcek, who's a farmer here in Indiana County. And I will turn it over back to Cindy.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a lot of really great information. Don't forget, you will probably be I think you'll be directed to a survey to fill out if you would. That would help us in knowing how we can improve and what we can do in the future. It's a great seminar. Thank you so much. And I think we're probably at the end. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.